Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining this OSF-sponsored side event at the 65th session of the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. My name is Matt Wilson. I'm a division director with global programs at the Open Society Foundation. And I am very privileged to welcome this outstanding panel. We're joined today by President Juan Manuel Santos and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Y.B. Nurul Izzah, a member of parliament from Malaysia, and former Mayor Savante Myrick, Ithaca, New York. Starting this session, we will hear opening comments from OSF President Mark Malloch-Brown. Mark Malloch-Brown, thank you so much for taking the time, and President Malloch-Brown, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I think I didn't get unmuted quite in time, so let me try again. Matt, thanks. And it's a real pleasure to listen in on such an extraordinary panel today. Three individuals who've really grappled with this issue in their political lives. Juan Manuel Santos, the extraordinary, legendary former president of Colombia, Nurul Izzah Anwar, for whom this issue in Malaysia is a continuing one, I know, and Svante Myrick. Whether it is Colombia, Malaysia, or New York, each of the speakers really do represent that kind of political courage for really taking a stand for drug policy reform in very different contexts and very different issues in many cases that they formed. But in each, they're dealing with electorates and with corners of public opinion in their countries, which are always ready to jump on the drug issue for easy political advantage and to kind of coarsen the debate and leave very little space for enlightened policy. And so we've seen drug policies in the hands of the wrong kind of political leaders being used to target minorities and the poor, to silence dissent, and to justify and unleash security forces from appropriate controls of the rule of law. And, just to take a very contemporary event that we're all watching, I think in dismay, what's going on in Ukraine. Part of President Putin of Russia's case for the attack against Ukraine was not only to call them Nazis, but also drug addicts, somehow seeking with that reference to associate them with crime and depravity and to call on a huge wall of stigma, really, to delegitimize and dehumanize both at home and abroad. And it isn't a new tactic in Russia, where we worked for many years and saw these issues in the jails and elsewhere in Russian society. And it's not surprising that there's been a very high HIV burden because of a lack of honesty in dealing openly and forthrightly with issues of drug treatment. Or take the example of the Philippines, a country I know well, where President Duterte, who has killed at least 12,000 and some estimates go as high as 30,000 people and arrested more than 300,000, has used this sort of drug paranoia as very central to this populist campaign to really crush dissent and restrain a free and open media. And we've seen in Brazil, where President Bolsonaro has invested heavily on a war on drugs as a gang, part of a populist political campaign. So drug reform in many ways is a bulwark of democracy, an enlightened, civil, engaged debate about the right kind of drug policies to protect users and try and secure space for them inside the law, not outside, is something which it needs brave politicians to stand up for and speak up for, because this issue of winning round the public is not an easy one. It's a much easier default option to just speak against drug users, to push them into the corner rather than bring them in to society. And of course, at election time, when political passions are high and there's often not much space for complexity of argument, that's when one sees, drug policy easily vilified and in other ways taken advantage of by the politicians who wish to do that. So I salute our brave panelists for the stand and leadership they've shown and look forward to them sharing their lessons with us. Back to you, Matt.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. President Santos, I know it's a bit early there in Bogota, and thank you so much for making yourself available to us. It's really an honor to speak with you. In 2016, your administration signed a peace accord with the FARC, the oldest insurgency in the Western Hemisphere. For the first time in history, a peace agreement included an entire chapter on drug-related issues and made a serious attempt to prioritize rural development and public health approaches over law enforcement. Throughout that, and still today, there's a fierce political opposition, actively resistant to changing course in drug policy. What did you learn from that period? And as a president, how does one balance a progressive vision with a viable political platform?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank the Open Society, because Open Society has been on this issue for a long time. I salute Mark Malloch-Brown and congratulate him because he's now the head of Open Society. We have worked together for some time. Extraordinary man. And thank you for continuing to grapple this issue because it's so important. In my case, well, I come from probably the country that has suffered the most in the so-called war on drugs that was declared more than 50 years ago. I think no other country has lost so many leaders, has made such sacrifices in this war, and we are still the number 1 exporter of cocaine to world markets, and the drug issue here is extremely important 50 years after. And my own experience forced me to evolve from having a very hardline punishment or prohibition stance to what I feel today and absolutely convinced that if we don't legalize, we will never be able to control. And the first thing that we must always repeat every time we talk about this issue is nobody is in favor of the use of drugs. Nobody is defending the use of drugs. We are simply wanting to try to control it and among many evils, choose the lesser evil. In the case in my case, when I became president, I had already been Minister of Defense, and probably the person in the world who has eradicated, fortunately, more coca plants, who have sprayed more coca plants, and who had extradited more drug traffickers to the United States than any other country in the world. However, I was convinced that that was not working, and so I tried to change that policy. And at the same time, I started a peace process. And strangely enough, in the 2 initiatives, I was warned that both are very politically costly. They say you were elected as a war hero, and as soon as you sit down with adversaries to negotiate peace, your adversaries, your political adversaries, will simply slaughter you and you will lose your political capital. But it is the only way to achieve peace. And I said, well, that's what I want. And I did it. And it happened. My political capital went down. But I continued and we achieved peace. The same with the issue of drugs. I was told, don't speak about it as president. This is very unpopular. But I said, but it's the only way that we can start uh, making the necessary reforms. And I started to talk about it, and I was attacked viciously. I remember uh, going to the streets, and many of the mothers shouted at me, "Why do you want to poison our kids? Why do you want to stimulate drug consumption?" So I had to make a lot of meetings to uh, to talk with these mothers, and I remember asking them, "Listen, do you have a daughter? Do you have a son?" And they said, "Yes." If he or she is consuming drugs, uh, would you prefer that she went to an institution that would help her with her problem, or that she would go to jail? And they said, "No, no, an institution that would help her with her problem." And I said, "Well, that's exactly what I am trying to do, to make this issue, this problem, a public health issue, and have another approach, because the prohibition, the only helps the mafias and produces a lot of money to finance the violence." And so all of them said, "Oh, Mr. President, why did you not explain this before?" So that taught me a lesson. It's so important to insist on trying to explain why this policy is a correct policy. There is enormous amounts of evidence, and we have to insist, because, like Malloch-Brown just said, this is one of the issues where populist positions, where politics enters, and it's so easy to stigmatize uh, the position of regulating drugs, and so easy and so popular to take the hard line stand, the prohibitionist stand. It is very popular. So politically, it's a very sensitive, very difficult. But what I have learned is that you need to persevere and explain many, many times. And like in any political message, you need to repeat it 1,000, 10,000 times for people to start hearing. In my case, we were able to convince not only many people in my country, but the whole of the Latin American continent and the whole of the Americas. Because with President Obama, we convened a special session of the OAS to ask for a special session of the UN to to discuss this problem. And this special session of the UN, as you all know, was held in 2016, and there we encountered a tremendous opposition from China, from Russia, from the Middle Eastern countries, and we advanced, but very little in the world and the UN stand against on this issue. And we must persevere, because the problem right now is worse in our region, and I think in the whole world, than it was 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. The problem, the opioids crisis in the U.S., for example, is much uh, bigger than it was some years ago. So it's a matter of being pedagogic, to being like a teacher, explaining until people understand. And there is tremendous amount of evidence to be able to try to convey the message. And again, this becomes very political, and there you have to also persevere. We are right now in the elections. This government, the government that succeeded me, went backwards because it's a very populist government. Right wing, the prohibitionist stand is the one that they assumed, but now the government is very unpopular, and many of the candidates, for the first time, are daring to discuss the issue in the campaign. Before, nobody dared even to discuss the issue. Now they are taking a stand. I think this is a big step forward, and this is what we need to maintain in order to change things. And I am optimistic that simply because the prohibitionist poster uh, is simply demonstrating that it doesn't work, that in the end there will be a change politically, as we are seeing in the US and in Europe and some countries in Latin America, not so much in Asia, but I think we need to persevere.
President Santos, thank you so much. And we've only got a couple minutes left here before I should move on to the next panelist. But we've just seen a new Congress elected in Colombia, and the presidential election looms in May. Briefly, sort of what is your anticipation that some new coalitions can be formed in this Congress to advance drug policy reforms? And then what do you think that advocates and politicians need to be doing right now in order to secure some of those reforms in the short term?
Well, the new Congress is clearly a more progressive Congress today. The sort of progressive group doesn't have a overall majority, but it's much bigger. The ones that were very against any change of the hardline policies were defeated, and I am certain that this issue will be a very important issue in the next Congress. And I think that we need to continue to give many of the members of the new Congress the evidence, the information, because when they have the evidence and they have the information, and I have done that many times, they understand and they become enthusiasts. So what I think we should do, not only in Colombia, all around the world, is in a way what I am now a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policies. We are trying to portray this, and we've been working with Open Society for many years. I think those type of messages need to be multiplied, and I think this is the only and the correct way to proceed.
President Santos, thank you so much. I hope we can return to some of this in the Q&A. And for any audience member who would like to submit a question, I should mention that the Q&A function, please submit it there, and our communications team will be bringing those questions out in the last 10 minutes. So now I'd like to turn to YB Iza from Malaysia. YB Iza, I have followed your voice the past few years, particularly your advocacy against the death penalty around Muhammad Luqman, and it's a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you so much for being here. My first question is really trying to think about Malaysia. It seemed poised several years ago to really make some advances on drug policy reform. But since then, there have been several political transitions, and it appears that the pathway for reform is less linear. How do you think momentum for reform can be rebuilt and cross-party support for drug policy reform strengthened, given the volatility of Malaysian politics today?
Thank you very much, Matt. Lord Malloch-Brown, on behalf of OSF, for having me here. It's a great honor, of course, to speak alongside President Santos, former Mayor Spante. I think, Matt, you rightly pointed out the key problem afflicting Malaysia when it comes to consistent reforms on drug policy. We have seen 3 prime ministers over the course of 3 years. So before the pandemic until today, you see a worsening of drug problems, more people actually, left behind in prisons. And in Malaysian prisons, 60% of those who are behind bars are there just due to petty, minor drug charges. So I think it's very, very crucial to understand one of the key determinants in ensuring that we can salvage the reform agenda is to actually have mechanisms such as a legislative or parliamentary-based bipartisan setup, which will stand the test of politics or political upheaval. One of which that I'm a member of, it's the all-party parliamentary group on the reforms of prisons and places of detention. It's chaired by a member of parliament from the ruling party. I come from the opposition, but because everyone understands the need to support, to really bring forth, reforms in terms of, whether it's prison reforms across the criminal justice system, then it helps us further the cause. Now, does this mean it's enough? I don't think so. Certainly, we have faced many challenges, but one of the other things other than this mechanism is really engaging with the key stakeholders, one of which is the Malaysian prison department or prison headquarters. It's funny, I've actually engaged with the prison headquarters across 4 prime ministers in Malaysia, and even when my father was detained. But the issue is the Malaysian prison department has actually been very supportive of the agenda. So knowing which stakeholder across the stakeholder spectrum that's in support of such an agenda will help push things along. So they have a clear blueprint. They want to support harm reduction, which is also inclusive of reform of drug laws, which are archaic in Malaysia. But the point is, how do we make sure that we include the different reps from the Attorney General's chambers, from the prison department, the civil servants from the relative ministries, including the Home Affairs, who can be the spokesperson even as ministers change. So I think that's one of the key things. President Santos is completely right. I'm quite, marveling at the fact that the defense minister at one point can take the position to understand it must be evidence that supports our decision making. The time for populism, it affects people's lives. And in this regard, I think the 2 key items have helped Malaysia, although yes, the opposition-led government back in the year 2018 wanted to decriminalize drug laws, especially with regards to personal possession. That has somehow, unfortunately, been halted temporarily. But I still believe if we keep, we keep pushing back, keep communicating the message, we will get somewhere.
Thank you, YB Iza. And along that line of pushing the message, one amazing thing about Malaysia, but also a challenge for sure, is that it has such significant ethnic and linguistic and religious diversity, and political parties, draw their support from different bases. As you've spoken out against the death penalty for drug offenses and supported harm reduction approaches, how do you approach working with and communicating across the electorate, build support for these political and policy changes? And how do you work with different religious communities in your context?
So, Matt, the majority of drug users who are incarcerated today in Malaysia are Malay Muslims, predominantly Muslims. And that's why when you talk about the issue of criminal justice reform, it's huge, right? There's the abolishment of the death penalty. There's also harm reduction, maximizing it, because in Malaysia, what's popular is basically methadone, and that only affects heroin users. How about, multi-opioid users? The rest are not being covered because we haven't really updated the spectrum of drugs and medicines to address this. So because of this, I feel one key thing is to decouple what is more acceptable amongst the electorate for now. So you approach and utilize a gradual phase to gain support, and harm reduction is it, because even the current Home Minister, we're not best friends, but my point is I can work with him, I can push so that he will introduce the Drug and Substance Abuse Act, which he mooted back in February last year, to enable the ease of which people get treatment instead of imprisonment. So even though he's a very hardline, right-wing conservative, but he supports harm reduction, not abolishment of death penalty. So you decouple and you start kind of push where's the agenda that people can accept, and we are working with mosques. It's unfortunate that the pandemic has halted our methadone in mosque mobile programs. Because for me, I got the religious leaders in most of the states in Malaysia who agree, yes, you should advocate for methadone. You should treat, the drug users. Imprisoning them do not help matters. So having that acceptance, helps us secure the support. But then, you need to do more, because it's not just Muslims, right? You also want other places of worship. And I feel that the pandemic really, has delayed many efforts, but I still think you must take into account the local religious aspects, right? You communicate to mothers. I do the same. You have to talk to mothers. What if your son was addicted? What would you do? Do you want to throw him in behind bars? And you realize people respond to that, and you don't want to give a sense just because you have been addicted to this particular substance. Do your family, do people around you, do your community give up on you? Of course not. So I think this communication aspect is something that we must take very seriously, and it has to be very strategic, because one wrong move, hey, we have so many pushback, and we have to guard against that.
Waibi Izzah, thank you so much, and really your courage on this issue is admirable. It's a real honor to speak with you. Thank you so much. Now we'll turn to the former mayor of Ithaca, Savante Myrick. Mayor Myrick, it's wonderful to see you again. We first met back in 2016, and at that time you released the Ithaca Plan, which was built around the 4 pillars of prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and public safety. It charted a pragmatic and bold and progressive pathway at a municipal level. My recent personal experience of local advocacy in New York State suggests that even in a municipality that is generally considered liberal, on the specific issue of drugs, these communities can be fiercely resistant to local change. So in your experience, what local actors presented the greatest opposition, and how did you approach building popular support to overcome those local objections?
And to stall and give myself time, I want to begin by thanking you. Thank you very much for having me here, but also for Open Society's support for so many very important things, but especially for ending the war on drugs. This is, Lord Malloch-Brown said it as succinctly and eloquently as I've ever heard it said, that the war on drugs is, of course, has always been a proxy, a way to justify the state's use of force on whoever is the undesirable target. And that's certainly true in the United States. It's true in the state of New York, and it's true in the city of Ithaca. And I feel very honored to be here at such a distinguished panel. In such a relatively small municipality, that it was my honor to serve as mayor of. I'll give you my experience, which was, who doesn't like this? And how do you work around it? How do you build popular support? Well, some of it is what you'd expect, right? Local business groups are always concerned, how is this going to affect their bottom line? Homeowners are concerned, how is this going to affect their bottom line? We were going to bring the first supervised injection facility to the United States of America. Now, even though Sarah Evans up in Vancouver had demonstrated that supervised injection facilities lowered crime and property crimes, increased the uptake of people going into and successfully completing rehab, even though countries from Switzerland to Australia had demonstrated that this had already worked. There was just fear. There is fear. And as the other speakers said, I think for good reason, we are often in this space, in the space of a fight for a more reasonable, rational, and humane drug policy, we always lean on the data. We go straight to it. I think because we're trying to assuage people's fears. Tell them, no, 35% less crime, 40% more likelihood of rehab. We go to the numbers. We go to an evidence-based approach. And I just want to say that in my experience, an evidence-based approach is necessary but not sufficient. That before you can tell people what you know, they need to know why you care. And especially at that time, so I was 25 years old. I was 2 years into being mayor, and most folks in my community did not know about my personal story, which is that I had lived the first 6 months of my life in a homeless shelter, first 8 years of my life in and out of homelessness because of my father's substance abuse disorder and because of the war on drugs, both things combined, that channeled him in and out of these cycles of incarceration and mandatory rehab, and didn't work. It just didn't work. It didn't work for him. It didn't work for our family. And I had spent so much time, I'd spent 2 decades trying to hide any evidence of that, trying to erase it from my presentation, from my background. I went off to an Ivy League school and tried to fit in with the fraternity guys and pretend like there was not somebody in my family who had a substance use problem. And I got into elected office, became mayor, and wanted to make these changes because I knew they were the right thing to do, right? I followed the data. I took the classes. I read about what was happening in Vancouver and across the world, and I thought that we too could do better. And what I found was such fierce resistance until I started telling my story. And then what I found out was that the shame, the secret, the stigma that I had been trying to hide all these years is universal. And it is shameful only because of our silence around it. And that at almost every public event, I would have somebody come up to me and say, you know, for you, it was your father. For me, it was my mother. Or just like your father, my brother has struggled. Or just like your father, my sister, myself, my cousin, my best friend, my husband, my wife. Personalizing, as our previous 2 presenters have said, personalizing this battle and making clear, and then you can pivot. You can pivot and say, look, let's agree that we want to eradicate drug use. How much longer do you want to give the war on drugs to do it? We've tried about 50 years now. We've spent in America $1 trillion, and drug use has not changed in America one bit. The same percentage of folks are struggling with substance use disorder. So if you want what we want, then come on board. And as President Santos said so eloquently, and it's a pleasure to be here with President Santos, his son Martin, I know and admire quite a lot, as he said, the best thing you can do is be persistent. So here's my advice I could give to any elected official who'd like to try this. Try it early in your term, because good governance plus time is good politics. And you will need time. You will need time to sell it, to explain it, to let it work, so that you can get reelected and you can see your ideas through to completion.
Mayor Myrick, thank you so much for sharing that personal story and that advice. It kind of takes me to my next question, which is really this sort of interplay between advancing progressive drug policy reform, some sort of continuation of a law and order rhetoric, and then building a winning coalition. You first won election at 24. In 2015, you won a second term with 89% of the vote. And in 2019, well after the Ithaca plan, you won a third term with 76% of the vote. I think you just started to suggest a little bit your approach was to, put the bold reform up front and use the time you had to implement it. But many elected officials are going to continue to see this as a third rail issue, and historically it has been for a long time. So with your electoral victories, what is your secret sauce, and can you expect elections to really serve as this forum for robust debate on drug policy reform, or should elected officials continue to worry that it's a third rail?
A good question, and the answer, and I'll give you a politician's answer, which is you're right on both counts. Look. I believe it was Sun Tzu in The Art of War that said, the battle is won before it's even fought. And on so many issues related to policy, and drug policy is no different, we need to win the battle of public opinion in between elections. We cannot expect our politicians to run on these platforms, to build popular support themselves, and then see it through in the finish line. Civil society is so important. And this is where the Soros family will never get enough credit for what they've done, and where open society will never get enough credit for what they've done. And of course, you don't seek credit, which is part of why you won't get credit. But it is so incredibly important that the education of elected officials, that the steady drumbeat that organizations like the Drug Policy Alliance provide here in the United States help move, even in times when folks may not be looking. They want to recognize that a couple dozen states have now not only legalized marijuana, but states are moving deeper and deeper into disentangling the war on drugs, Oregon being the most exciting example. And they're doing that even at a time when you might look at the national level and say, oh, geez, well, you have a President Donald Trump, or you have an Attorney General Jeff Sessions, both who have beyond regressive views on these issues. They've got really Stone Age views on these issues. Well, it's because we win those battles before the elections even happen. It's by being on the ground, being engaged in community. I think it's also a benefit. You mentioned my age at the time. It is a benefit to encourage more young people into elected office. Young people are they have energy, they have creativity, they have a moral authority, which is really important. They are also wonderfully, wonderfully ignorant and naive. And I was both ignorant and naive when I first took office about how difficult this was going to be. And I was also naive of sort of the battle wounds that other politicians will carry around with them. Even, God bless him, our current president, President Biden, when he's been elected office for 50 plus years, which means that he is, like many elected officials, always fighting the last war, right? So even though support for legalization of marijuana is at record level highs, he remembers the Democrats taking an electoral drubbing in 1994, and is worried that could happen again if he comes out ahead on this issue. Encouraging new, fresh blood in our political system is one way we can make breakthroughs, not just in the ending the war on drugs, but in so many issues, from advancing our sustainable development goals to ending inequality. We'll find that rising generations are willing to tackle these challenges in ways that put their naivete and ignorance to good use.
Thank you, Mayor Myrick. So now I've got a couple questions from the audience, and the first I will direct at President Santos. And Mark, if you're still on and available to join us, I think it would be great to get your input on this question too. And here it is. Mark and President Santos, you both know the UN very well. how do you think we can bring the UN along in support of a more modern drug policy approach?
Well, first of all, let me say two things very briefly. First, that I forgot to underline, the evolution of the mentality of the public opinion in Colombia. Right now, many of the former hardliners accept the argument, but they still are afraid of the reaction of the public electorally. So what they're saying now, many of them is, okay, I accept that, but unless the whole world does it, we can't do it because Colombia would become a pariah. This is one of the arguments. And that goes directly to your question right now. The second issue is the following, and I have been able to prove it. Many of the hardliners in any country are very concerned about security. Security is the number one priority politically. And linking the regulation of drug policies and doing away with prohibition, the positive effect, not the negative effect, because today, in the minds of the majority of people, they relate drug legalization with more violence. It's exactly the opposite. And insisting in that issue, I think politically it's very important. Now, to your question about the UN, Mark knows the UN much better than I do. You need to try to convince the pockets of resistance, and I mentioned them: China, Russia, and the Middle East. Those are the ones that, when we started to promote a change in the UN stance in this war, they were very, very. So it's a matter like in any country individually, at the level of the world, the UN, we must explain to them how this issue, how the war has simply failed. A war that has not been won in 50 years is a war that failed, that we must change the strategy, and we must insist on that. And at every discussion, and slowly, I think that's a way to convince people or countries like the ones that are receiving the UN to change their stand. I don't know what Mark thinks about this, but this is my own experience.
Well, thank you, Juan Manuel, and by the way, thank you to all three presenters. Svante, it was just, and Narul, it was just fabulous to listen to you both, as well as to the president. Really fabulous. Look, I think that there is the UN is caught in a strange corner on this one, because the location of its drug work is connected with its police work in an agency in Vienna, away from either its development capital, which is New York and UNDP, which I used to run, and its humanitarian capital, which is Geneva. So it's kind of hooked up with entirely the wrong set of disciplines around policing, not around development. And, it is very striking that UNDP takes a very different line on these issues, and I think has done some work, I believe, jointly with OSF, around more enlightened policies. And the second point is the one that the president makes, which is that, there's been a Russian head of that agency at times. It is, very much out of the mainstream. And so, a combination of the countries which have chosen to be influential in it, and its location, and the intellectual place it's located in the UN, have all isolated it from the kind of debate and discussion we're having today. And it's very overdue, and I really had hopes that the current Secretary General would correct this. But he hasn't yet.
President Santos, Mark, thank you so much. I've got one more audience question, this one directed at Mayor Myrick and YB Iza. And Mayor Myrick, you mentioned the amazing work that the Drug Policy Alliance is doing. And so, civil society clearly has a role to play in advancing drug policy reform, and in many ways being out in front of elected officials on the issue, trying to make more space for these policies to become applicable. But at the same time, that position can put them at odds with politicians and elected officials and government, right? They can be seen as criticizing or outlandish or easy to dismiss. So what is your advice, Mayor Myrick and YB Iza? How should civil society work on this issue to both push the envelope, but form an allyship with elected officials and government to be partners?
Well, my first reaction is something that Wade Henderson, a mentor of mine at the National Leadership Council, once said. He often says, if you want a friend, you have to be a friend. And being a friend means showing up, right? When do politicians care when you show up? Of course, at the voting time. But politicians are also humans, most of them anyway. And they appreciate an intersectional kind of support. They also appreciate the kind of conversations that Drug Policy Alliance's executive director, Cassandra Frederic, is uniquely good at. And I know her because she helped way before she was executive director, helped guide our reforms in Ithaca. And she has a way of doing what I think we all have to do in the civil society space, which is not call out people, but call them in. It is really tempting to gain followers, to gain attention, to gain eyeballs with the megaphone in the rally out front of the elected official's office. Usually what that does is just dig that elected official in deeper. They're convinced that, okay, anybody rallying outside of my office will never be on my side. And so let me pivot to find some friends elsewhere. By acting as a friend and calling people in, saying, hey, look, we get it. We get that this is difficult. We get that you're gonna need air cover. We get that you're gonna have a lot of hard conversations. Let us help you. Let us be your friend as you engage in these efforts. I think that's something that the DPA, I should also disclose, I'm a member of the board of the Drug Policy Alliance. So while I'm complimenting them, it might sound like I'm complimenting myself, but I'll qualify that by saying that they've been doing great work for 30 plus years. And I've been on the board for about 5 weeks. So I can't yet take credit for their work.
Thanks. YB Iza?
Yeah, I think, what former Mayor Svante has said, which really struck me, was the fact that, relative proximity to real life experiences, to real life problems, really gives you a sense of understanding what people face. And sometimes politicians lose that touch. You're so fixated over cycles of elections, and who better than the groups of non-governmental organizations who are dealing with such problems with people who are using drugs, with the problems on the ground day in, day out. So for me, they form such they're such useful collaborators, especially as you face a pandemic where governments sometimes, well, most times don't get it right. And you do need these collaborators to fill up the gaps because there's just too many people, especially in the vulnerable segments, who are falling through the cracks. So the issue of proximity, it just makes sense. Even in the all-party parliamentary group, thank God our secretariat is powered by actual medical experts, actual, doctors and lawyers, because if you leave politicians, to their own devices, God knows what will come out from it. So I think it's important to just allow the evidence to lead some of the policy decision making. And that's what I've also done in my, small constituency of Permatang Power Penang. We got a poverty expert, an economist, to conduct multidimensional poverty index study during the pandemic, unearth COVID-adjusted poverty line, because from there you kind of push policymakers, hey, these are the lower income households, these are the challenges, the addiction that they're grappling with, and you're not really showcasing a relevant measurement if you don't allow experts to lead the way. So, at least the Malaysian government and the Economic Planning Unit is taking it up. But the point is, this is only one small bit. So always in the mind is proximity, and non-governmental organizations will help fill up the gaps where, and in many cases, it's the truth, politicians fail to. And I think it just makes a lot of sense. So that's a message that we have to remind, don't be insecure.
Thank you. So here we are at the end of our time. President Santos, YB is Mayor Myrick, Mark, thank you so much for making the time for this conversation. In recognition that we are at a UN event, I would like to say that I condemn in no uncertain terms the unlawful and unjustified invasion of Russia into Ukraine, and that my heart and our heart goes out to the people of Ukraine in this desperate time of need. So thank you all so much for joining this panel. We appreciate you, and I hope the rest of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs goes well.
Hear, hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hear, hear.